Hey, what's up everybody? It's Lids, and we're back for some more Gwent, and today we're going to talk about preparation for the third Balanced Council vote for December 2023. As a reminder, CDPR is no longer doing card balance updates. Instead, it is up to the players to vote to increase or decrease card power and provisions by 1. Each month, up to 10 cards in each category that receive the most votes will get changed. That means that if we coordinate our votes, we can more likely see the changes that we're looking for. However, as we've seen from the two previous voting seasons, it is not easy to balance cards well. Last time we talked a lot about what we should consider when making our votes, including negative bias, positive bias, revenge votes, same changes having different effects on different cards and archetypes, bigger changes not necessarily being the best changes, not wanting unplayable cards, thinking about who we're making our changes for, avoiding accidental overcorrections, as well as the challenges of communicating and coordinating the changes we wanted to make, and the huge uncertainty of what changes other people might be looking for. I explained all those things last time with the idea that we could look back at those concepts for future votes because they'll always be relevant. And after we saw the second round of votes come in, that's even more so the case now. But I'd like to add just one more design concept for us to consider, our target power level. Basically, how strong are we trying to make all the cards? Because as I said last time, in theory, we're trying to get cards with the same provision cost to have roughly the same value, bearing in mind that of course, there are a bunch of different ways to provide value, and cards that are higher risk should have a higher upside, but also a lower low side. But even if we want cards with the same provision cost to have roughly the same value, whatever type of value it is that that card provides, what is the target value? Basically, do we want every card and every archetype to be tier 1 effectiveness? Because that way every card is competitive. Or do we say that no, by definition, the tier 1 cards and decks are inherently overpowered, that's why they're at the top, so rather than trying to make everything at the level of what is currently tier 1, instead the ideal power level that we want every deck to be is a little bit lower than that. Ultimately, that is of course a matter of personal preference, but there are some important implications there. Because if, for example, we want everything to be at the level of what is currently tier 1, then that means we need to buff a whole lot of stuff to get there, including some cards that are already decent, which on one hand is kind of exciting, because in general people like when some of their favorite cards get buffed, but on the other hand, you could argue that the cards and archetypes that are currently tier 1 are overpowered and oppressive, so having that be the standard that we're looking for could exacerbate that dynamic, discouraging players from using other types of decks. But if you do set your target a little bit lower than what is currently tier 1, then of course that means that there will be more nerfs. And the lower you set that target, the more nerfs you would need to get there. Which to a certain extent, people might be supportive of, if people agree about which cards they want to nerf, though based on what we've seen from previous voting sessions, that may not be the case. And nerfs, no matter how warranted they may be, are often met with pessimism. So nerf too aggressively and you risk a lot of people leaving the game. And if you go too far and nerf cards that a lot of people didn't want to see nerfed, then you may see those changes get undone in the next voting season, as we saw was the case for many cards in voting season 2. Personally, I think that the top 1 or 2 decks are too strong, so our goal should not be to make every deck that powerful, and instead we should take what are currently the top 1 or 2 decks and bring them down to the level of other decks and archetypes. So let me know which deck you think is a good standard for what is currently a well-balanced deck that we can use as a reference point to try to target for other archetypes. Doing that should help us draw the line for which cards deserve buffs, nerfs, or are appropriately balanced as is. Because I think one of the big reasons why we saw a lot of the Season 1 votes get undone in Season 2 may have been that some of the cards that got nerfed were strong, but they may not have been the absolute strongest cards, so some people felt that those nerfs were unjustified. And while generally it's probably best to nerf the most overpowered cards first, depending on where you set the standard for the desired power level of each deck, there could still be several other cards that also deserve nerfs. So while there may not always be a consensus opinion on which cards are the number 1 nerf targets, we have to trust each other enough that if we miss one of the important cards in one season, we'll be sure to follow up in the next season to get that card. So just because a card that got nerfed wasn't the absolute strongest card in the game does not inherently mean that we need to undo that change in the next season. Otherwise, very few changes will remain, making our votes, and the Balanced Council system as a whole, less meaningful. Before we talk about what we want to vote for this season, let's look back at the previous 2 voting season results. As a reminder, in the first season we saw the top 15 cards get changed, but we never knew the rank order of the vote recipients. Whereas in season 2 we got a last second change to allow only the top 5 vote recipients per category to get changed, but CDPR did tell us what all the top 15 vote recipients were in rank order for each category. And that's a big deal because it helps to reduce that uncertainty that we were talking about before. In the past, we had no idea if there was a card that almost got enough votes to get changed, but didn't quite make it. Whereas after Season 2, we have a much better idea of which cards got close. For example, at the end of Season 1, we saw just Vesemir get power buffed, but the other members of the Wolf School trio, Lambert and Eskel, did not. That seemed really weird at the time, because you always play those 3 cards together, and playing one summons the other 2 out from your deck, so they're supposed to be functionally the same. So did people want to buff Lambert and Eskel as well, but they didn't quite get enough votes to make that happen? Or did people decide that Vesemir was the most important, and therefore he deserved to be stronger than the other 2? Obviously, we assumed the former, but we didn't get confirmation until the end of Season 2 when we saw Lambert and Eskel almost get power buffed, but just missed the cutoff. So what this tells us is that in most cases, any card that you see that almost won in Season 2 is at least somewhat likely to win its category in this Season 3 vote. So if you're concerned about voting for a card that might not be popular enough to win, you can play it relatively safe by voting for some of the cards that you see here, with one big exception: power decrease for Tyr. Tyr is strong, so understandably, some people want to nerf him. However, a power nerf will do absolutely nothing. And I'm not just saying that to exaggerate and be dramatic, it quite literally will do nothing at all. That's because Tyr is a card that transforms. His first form can deal some damage and potentially get resilience. And while that has some potential for carryover, that is definitely the weaker of the 2 forms by a significant margin, and not the thing that people want to get nerfed. Once Tyr evolves into his second form is when he starts doing the crazy graveyard buffing stuff, which has way more potential than the first form. So for people who want to nerf Tyr, it's that second form that you want to target. The tricky thing is, if you reduce Tyr's base power, that only affects the first form. So we could reduce the base power of Tyr's first form down to 1, but that would still make no difference, because once Tyr evolves, he will always be on 9 base power, because we cannot change the base power of that second form with the Balanced Council. If you don't believe me, just look at Torres. In Season 1, we reduced the base power of the first form by 1, but as you can see, the second form remained at 4 base power. In this case, that was fine, because unlike with Tyr, it was Torres' first form that was the powerful one and the target of the nerf, so it made sense. However, because it is Tyr's second form that is more powerful, that would not work for him, and you are quite literally just throwing your vote away for no good reason if you vote to power nerf Tyr. So if you think Tyr deserves to be nerfed, the only way to make that nerf meaningful is to increase his provisions, not decrease his base power. And given how many people voted to decrease Tyr's base power, it seems like a lot of people didn't realize that. Now let's quickly talk about our voting strategy before we go into the cards that we're choosing for this season. Overall, our approach is to assume that the most obviously overpowered cards will get enough votes for a nerf, regardless of whether we vote for them or not. Therefore, it makes no difference if we vote for those cards, and we might as well choose to vote for some other cards that aren't quite as popular, but could still use some buffs or nerfs, using our collective voting power to reach the 50 vote minimum threshold. Previously, we were fairly ambitious with some of our votes because we had assumed that up to 15 could get changed per category, but now that we know that only the top 10 will make it through, our changes this time are a little less ambitious, so that hopefully we still make it into that top 10. Let's start with power increase, which, for what it's worth, is in most cases the least impactful category, but it's at the top. 2 really underpowered units that almost never see play because they're just terrible. So choosing the Naglfar Taskmaster and the Drummond Villager are both very safe options because it's not as if one extra point is going to make either of these cards absolutely dominant. And that is deliberate, because our goal here is to take them from never being used to at least being worth considering. That way we can increase deck variety, while avoiding the risk of accidentally over-buffing an archetype, which could potentially happen if we were to buff one card in an archetype, while several other people unexpectedly buff other cards in that archetype, collectively making that archetype way stronger than anyone anticipated. But our top card here is very different, because Master Puppets, of course, seizes one of your opponent's bronze units and then goes over to your opponent's side of the board, which means increasing the power of Master of Puppets is a nerf, not a buff. And that's because, unlike Naglfar Taskmaster or Drummond Villager, Master of Puppets is insanely strong. So strong that it was one of the most impactful cards in the previous Gwent Masters finals, to the extent that opposing players had to consider discarding all of their bronze units just to play around this. And if that sounds crazy, I agree, so let's do something about it. And while you definitely could justify a provision nerf for Master of Puppets, we're increasing the power instead so that way, when Master of Puppets goes to the other side of the board, that trade is not quite as valuable. In practice, this probably turns what was, I don't know, a 30-point play into now a 29-point play, which obviously isn't going to make a huge difference, so maybe Master of Puppets needs additional power increases, in which case we'll have to revisit it in the next season, or if it gets a provision nerf, then that's probably more immediately impactful, so that'd be fine too. We just already have a lot of things we're voting for in the provision increase category. But if for whatever reason you don't like one of the cards that I put in the provision increase category, then you could definitely vote for Master of Puppets there. Next, we've Power Decrease, and this is where we're going to target several cards from some very powerful archetypes, most notably Northern Realms Order Spam. We're including Rafford's Vengeance here because this is an extremely powerful engine, which usually your opponent will combine with Inspired Zeal to immediately get at least one unit on the board, but with that Inspired Zeal charge, that currently brings Rafford's Vengeance up to 7 power, which is high enough that it's very hard to remove it with damage in one turn. So by decreasing Rafford's Vengeance power by 1, that means that even with the Inspired Zeal charge, it's at just 6 power, at which point it's still relatively difficult to remove, but it is possible to get rid of it in one turn, and certainly doable to get rid of it in 2. Which, given how strong this card is definitely deserved. The only question here is, would we rather increase its provision cost? But as you're about to see, there are several other cards from that same archetype that will fall under that category instead. And it's a very similar idea with the Ildiko power nerf as well, because basically she is automatic, immediate Inspired Zeal in unit form. Sometimes she gets used in those Demivind, Mutagenerator, Rafford's Vengeance decks. Other times it's in Reaver's decks. But really, almost any deck can benefit from having Ildiko on the board. And between that amazing Inspired Zeal-like ability, her 6 base power and 4-point order, she can do way too many things too well and absolutely deserves a nerf of some variety. Once again, you could definitely justify giving her a provision nerf, making it harder to fit all of those big cards in the same deck. But because lots of Ildiko's value comes from her staying on the board, decreasing her power and therefore making it easier to remove her will make her a little less consistent, which is definitely warranted for a card that drastically increases the consistency of Northern Realms' many order spamming cards. There is some potential to overcorrect here because Ildiko and Rafford's Vengeance can sometimes be used in the same deck, and to be honest, we're going to target that deck even more, but we are talking about the number 1 deck here. And as I said before, since we're only getting the top 10 cards changed this season, not the top 15, we are targeting cards that are more likely to win. Then lastly, we have a power nerf for Alba Pikeman, because this is one of the best 5 provision cost cards in the game. In a vacuum, it's a 4-point body with 2 points of bleeding every turn, assuming that you played in the melee row, which is almost always what people do. And that's fairly reasonable. However, this card does not exist in a vacuum. You can use it in soldier decks, in which case that is probably about the value you're getting, but the main reason we're targeting Alba Pikeman is for Nilfgaard's status spam, because this is one of, if not the best setup card for that deck. Because with 1 Thirsty Dame on the board, this is 4 points per turn, and that's very easy to do. With 2 Thirsty Dames on the board, this is 6 points per turn, which is still not that difficult to do, especially once you factor in Masquerade Ball. With 3 Thirsty Dames on the board, which is fairly uncommon but is theoretically possible with the 2 starting Thirsty Dames and Masquerade Ball, this is 8 points per turn. Throw in how this also sets up Philippe to more quickly lock and poison units, get the otherwise difficult to acquire bleed status to get more points per turn from Rompali or even Van Morleham's Servant, and this is also the best setup for the Catriona, even if that's not that popular, and you realize that the Alba Pikeman just has so many synergies for Nilfgaard that this is so much more than a 2-point per turn engine. So why do we decrease the power? Because so much of the Alba Pikeman's value comes from getting 2 charges of bleed every turn, by putting it in the melee row in a flanking position. However, by reducing its base power and making it easier to remove the Alba Pikeman, when using the Alba Pikeman, it requires more thought about where best to play it. Yes, you could still put it in a melee flanking position, have 1 less power but get the same engine value as you had before, and barely notice the change at all. However, you have a higher risk of it getting destroyed. And if you anticipate that that might happen, it encourages players to either play it in the ranged flanking position to acquire armor, at which point it is now harder to remove than before. However, you're only generating 1 charge per turn, meaning that it no longer has quite the same crazy synergistic potential that it once had. I think that's a really reasonable way to approach this otherwise powerful card, by making players think a little more carefully about where to play the Alba Pikeman to get the most value out of it, rather than just putting it in the melee row every time. Alternatively, you could occasionally still put it in the melee flanking position and deliberately save charges to gain armor, although that's probably much more niche. Next, we have Provision Increase, which is of course another type of nerf, and in this case we're starting with the Frenzied Dow, which after the rework a little while ago, is now an extremely strong card. 7 base power for 7 provisions, and on deploy play 1 or more Rock Barrages from your deck, depending on how many constructs you've played in the game. Each Rock Barrage is 4 points of damage and movement, and even if you don't have any Rock Barrages left in your deck, you still move one of your opponent's cards. And in most cases, that means you're going to want to have already played 1 construct so that when you play the Frenzied Dow, you can play 2 Rock Barrages from your deck. If you do that, then that means you have a 7-point body, 8 points of damage that you can use on the same target or split across 2 different targets, movements, either on the same target or 2 different targets, and 2 thinning. I know that requires including an extra construct, playing one of those constructs, and having 2 Rock Barrages in your deck in the first place, but you're thinning out those Rock Barrages anyway, and that's 15 points of tempo, including great ways to deal with defenders or any other engine, especially if it's Rolock. So this is really just crazy value, even if you factor in how this requires that you build your deck a certain way. So a provision nerf is definitely warranted. Next, we have Ishora. Now, when she first got released, she was crazy powerful. Her Vice was lower, and she had 8 base power, but she is still insane. 7 base power is still decent tempo, and it's high enough that it's very difficult to answer her in 1 turn. And you're gonna need to answer her in 1 turn, because assuming that your opponent previously played 1 or 2 Open Sesames, they will be triggering that Vice at least once, almost immediately. And it is possible for them to trigger that Vice multiple times per turn. There are a lot of similarities between Ishora and Keltolis. Both have the potential to destroy a card per turn. Kelly does have 2 more base power, but costs 5 more provisions, is much more difficult to build a deck around, and can activate on your own units, which Ishora will never do. So if Kelly is balanced at 13 provisions, and Ishora is arguably better than Kelly, then why is Ishora 8 provisions? Obviously, they aren't carbon copies of each other, but it's close enough that there should not be a 5 provision difference, especially if you consider that all it takes to set up Ishora is spending coins, which every Syndicate deck already wanted to do, unlike for Kelly decks, which force you to fill your deck with boosting special cards, which is not necessarily Monster's greatest strength. Then lastly, this should come as no surprise to anyone, but the Onager is really freaking strong. So this is definitely a safe vote because I imagine there are a lot of people who want to nerf the Onager, and as I said before, this is one of the best cards in the best archetype, but Northern Realms has so many strong cards in its top few decks that I want to make sure that Onager doesn't somehow slip through the cracks this time, because somehow it's done that for 2 seasons already. There's definitely some potential to over-nerf Northern Realms order spam decks, because Onager very likely will get nerfed, in addition to potentially Rafford's Vengeance and Ildiko, like we talked about before, but there's also Temple of Melitele, Mutagenerator, and Demovind, all of which could get nerfed. And if all of those cards get nerfed, then yes, that will force players to swap out several cards in that deck. But that's the whole point of nerfing those cards, especially when it relies so heavily on spamming 5 provision units to maximize the boost from Mutagenerator. Increasing the provisions of several cards will either force those decks to drop some of the really overpowered cards, or reduce some of those 5 provision cards down to 4 provisions, at which point Mutagenerator is no longer as effective. So while that may sound kinda harsh, isn't that the result we're looking for? That, and at least for me, I think it is better to over-nerf the top deck, that way it no longer dominates, giving more time for other decks to shine, rather than over-buff a deck and have that deck absolutely crush everything, make everything else irrelevant, because then it feels like you either play that deck or you lose, which I think is a much less healthy dynamic for Gwent. So that's why our nerf votes have a lot more immediate potential impact than our buff votes. And of course, if we do go too far, we can make some corrections in the next season, though to be fair, a lot of these nerfs are deserved. Then lastly, we have Provision Decrease, which at least for units is a buff. And here we start with Melaine, and we voted for her in the bottom slot last time, hoping that maybe she'd win, though it seemed pretty unlikely. Yet, surprisingly, she placed in 14th, so we were actually kinda close. So we're bumping her up to the top spot to see if we can get her through this time. And the reason for Melaine is the same reason as last time. 8 points for 9 provisions is just bad value, but if we drop her down to 8 provisions, then you could potentially justify using her in some decks. But even then, it's not like we're about to create a monster that's going to absolutely dominate, so we don't have to worry about that. Next we have Brain, which is another criminally underpowered card that never sees play, and I'm convinced most people forget even exists. We've tried voting for her on 2 prior occasions in the top spot for power buff, but with no success, and admittedly, even if she were to win the power buff, she would probably still need another power buff before she would ever get considered, because she just doesn't fit naturally into any archetype. However, with a provision buff, that could be a quicker, more impactful way of getting people to consider her. And once again, even if she gets buffed like this, it's not as if we're creating some overpowered nightmare. And lastly, it's one more nerf for Northern Realms. Because in this case, reducing the power of a leader ability means that leader has one less provision to work with, because Northern Realms Inspired Zeal is absolutely busted. So once again, I acknowledge that I am being a bit of a hypocrite, because we are consistently targeting the same deck over and over again, but it is the top deck, and I don't necessarily expect every single one of these cards or leader abilities to win, especially because I think a lot of people are going to split their votes across the different cards. So while some definitely will get nerfed, I'm anticipating that some will still sneak by unchanged. So rather than putting all of our eggs in one basket, we're trying to approach Northern Realms order spam from several different angles, and as I said before, even if most of those nerfs go through, I still don't think that's the end of the world. We'll at least have a 1-month break from all the Inspired Zeal spam. And Inspired Zeal is just so versatile right now. Yes, the Demivind, Mutagenerator, Rafford's Vengeance, 5 provision order engine spamming decks are generally the most effective with this, but Inspired Zeal works really well with basically every Northern Realms archetype. So on one hand, you could say that's a good thing, that we're weakening Northern Realms' strongest ability, though I suppose you could make the counter argument that we might be punishing some decks that don't deserve to be punished. So I will admit that this one is a little bit controversial, but given how I have been filled with dread every time I see that my opponent is using Inspired Zeal, and it has been extremely popular, especially in the higher ranks, I think you can at least see where I'm coming from. So those are the things that I'm voting for, and I recommend that you consider voting for as well, so that we can increase our chances of making these changes happen. Notable exceptions to the things that we have here are, of course, those various other Northern Realms cards that we've mentioned, which we're assuming either are already going to get nerfed, so it doesn't make a difference if we target them or not, or we think that maybe 1 or 2 of them won't make it through, and therefore we have some backup plans here with our lists. But the other notable exception is Jan Calveat, because he is an auto-include in quite literally every single Nilfgaard deck. He got his power decreased by 1 in the first voting season, but that did basically nothing, because you don't play Jan for the tempo. I mean, yes, a 7-point body isn't bad, but his perfect consistency is invaluable, as it allows players to top deck every single good card that they have, and deliberately load the bottom end of their deck with terrible cards, and not get punished for it. So although I haven't voted for Jan because I assume that he is definitely going to win, whether I vote for him or not, I totally get where you're coming from if you want to nerf him. But if you do, make sure that it is a provision nerf rather than another power nerf, because that would actually make a meaningful difference, unlike the previous power nerf, which did basically nothing. Remember to submit your votes before the deadline, and you can change your vote anytime before that deadline by resubmitting. This is my best shot at getting our next vote right, so let me know down in the comments if you're voting with me. I'm happy to answer questions about the Balance Council process, or why we did or did not choose a specific card. As I said a couple weeks ago, I'm going to stop playing Gwent soon, so this is going to be my last Balance Council vote. But the principles that we've discussed should remain relevant for any future Balance Council vote, regardless of whether I'm suggesting specific cards for you to vote for or not. So these videos should be a valuable reference tool even long after I'm gone. If you liked the video, then make sure to hit the like and subscribe button to stay tuned for our final deck guide ever. Thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you next time.